So number 4 is looking at estimating your max VO2. So VO2 is oxygen consumption, not oxygen breathed in, but oxygen that's used at the cellular level, okay? And VO2 max then is your maximum capacity for oxygen consumption. VO2 max is strongly genetically determined. There are a couple of other factors, but mostly your VO2 max, once you've plateaued, you're not going to improve that any further. So further training improves our lactate threshold corner, but it doesn't improve VO2 max any further. I think if you go from sedentary, it's going to take you 10 to 12 weeks. If you're someone who's relatively fit and you just kind of slacked off your aerobics for a little while, take you somewhere around 6 to 8 weeks to get back to your plateau, okay? So improvements during that time would be probably because you were getting more oxygen to the muscles, but after that it's because we shift that lactate threshold. So VO2 max can be quite a useful tool to understand, but to measure it precisely involves lab equipment and sophisticated computer programming and things like that. So we don't have that in HPE, but we're very lucky that Dr. Barlow has that capacity over in biology. And I'll contact him in a few weeks. I don't know if he's got any students coming into the lab at all. I'm not quite sure what the science faculty are doing for their labs. So if it's possible, I'll go film something and show you that. But given that most of us are going to be working in a situation where we're not going to have access to an exercise physiology lab, right, then we have to have a way of estimating VO2 max, all right? So we've got several different ways, and they have varying levels of error in them, all right? So lab 4 is a non-exercise based estimation of VO2 max. So without too much of a stretch, you should be able to understand that if I'm not exercising and I'm not measuring or doing anything to use oxygen, then obviously this one has the most amount of error in it, all right? But it can be a useful tool under certain circumstances. So when do you think you might need to find out VO2 max on someone that you would have to use a non-exercise test on?
Like someone who's coming off an injury.
Okay, yeah, that would be good. If they're coming off an injury and they haven't been released for running or walking or anything else yet, definitely. What about if you are working with a normal population as a therapist or maybe a personal trainer, or you're working at a gym or at a YMCA or something like that? When might you need to use a non-exercise test first off? What about if someone's very sedentary or very overweight or even obese? Right? right? So if you're working with someone who's not in shape, they may not be fit enough yet to run an exercise estimate. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So, I'm just drawing you a not very good continuum here. Okay. So, we might have people who are unable, for whatever reason, to deal with, to handle an exercise test, okay? So we can use this non-exercise version that's in our book. We know it's not very accurate. There are some things that you have to gauge, like if they have done a little bit of training, how intense was that training? If they're untrained, really, you've just got to know their height, their age, right? Are they male or female? So it's kind of very rough, all right? So there's lots of error in this version. But it might be better than nothing, right? So it at least gives you a starting point, bearing in mind that we're going to pre-test our athletes or our trainees or our school children, right? Whoever I'm working with, we're going to do a pre-test of their cardiorespiratory fitness, their strength, their flexibility, their skill, competency, right? And then we're going to do an intervention. And the intervention is going to be, you know, learning how to throw a ball properly if we're looking at motor skills, or doing some aerobic training if we want to improve cardiorespiratory fitness, or teaching them good technique for strength exercises, resistance exercises, right? So that's going to be our intervention, and then we're going to post-test and see whether they got better, okay? So we may have to pre-post test here, or we have various options for an exercise test. So an exercise test still has error, but not as much error as a non-exercise test, right? And my options here could be cycling, so there's an ergometer test I can use. It could be walking, and I'll show you that one in a minute. It could be walk, jog, or it could be run. There may be a swimming one, but I don't know of it if there is. If you find a swimming one, please let me know, because that would be interesting to look at. I think that there's a rowing one as well, so on a stationary rowing machine, I think there might be one specifically for that as well. So when you're looking at these exercise tests, again, it depends on who you're working with, right? Because if I'm working with an athlete who is a cyclist, then giving them a run test doesn't accurately reflect their VO2 max if they're a trained cyclist, right? So it's important to use the right version of an exercise test. Let me just show you, oh no, that's going to disappear. I'll show you that at the end. Then we have, so we've got error here, and example. Oops. And then we have our exercise test. So in a XFIS lab or in a clinic somewhere, right, then that is going to be either on a treadmill or again on a cycle ergometer, might be on a rowing machine, but typically they're on treadmills or cycle ergometers, okay? And this one has the least error. Okay? So not no error, but the least error. So if you do a VO2 max test in a clinic or a lab, you're going to have a mask on that measures, and that mask is attached to the computer, and it measures gas exchange, all right? And then it gives all that information to the computer, and the computer does I don't know what, and it spews out an answer and tells you what your VO2 max is, right? So luckily we don't have to understand what the computer does. Dr. Barlow might make you understand what the computer does, but since I don't know, I'm not about to make you know. So this has the least error, but again, you know, you'll get different results from the same person if you do a run test and a cycle test, or a rowing test, right? Because they use different muscle groups. So it's the closest thing to the gold standard. Like if I want to know what my VO2 max really is, this is the best way of doing it. But you've got to have access to this fancy equipment and all that kind of thing, all right? Now, that's, what am I trying to say here? Going to a lab and running a VO2 max test on a treadmill still isn't exactly the same as going out and running at the trail, right? Because the lab environment is controlled and the temperature's controlled and there isn't wind to deal with or hills to deal, right? So it's a very controlled environment. They are getting much more sophisticated with the equipment now. So some sports science institutes have really small little packs that you can actually wear while you're out running or cycling, and they gather the gas exchange information, and then you take it and you download it to a computer. You still got to wear a mask though while you're out training. So it's still a little bit different from the real picture of, you know, and you can't, so far they haven't made them small enough that you could wear it during a football game or during a soccer game, for example, right? So we still don't have the ultimate picture of VO2 max within a game scenario, but we can get pretty close to what VO2 max is. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah? So had you been here, we would do your non-exercise one, and then we would do an exercise walk jog, which I'm going to ask you to do anyway on your own, but it will depend on your circumstances, right? So we'll get, when we get there, we'll talk about that a bit more. So you might, hopefully, end up with a non-exercise estimate and an exercise estimate, and you can compare them and see how different they are. Unfortunately, I can't get you to the lab so that you could take a treadmill test. But maybe I can, as I said, maybe I can go and film one, perhaps, if Dr. Barlow does have some students in the lab. I'm not quite sure. Okay? So when you're filling in lab 4, it asks you to use a Borg RPE scale to estimate your typical intensity of training, okay? In my copy of the workbook, and I had like the first edition, and I know they kind of changed up the layout a little bit on later runs, but in my book, there's a copy of that HPE scale on page 96. So you don't have to go digging that up on Google or try and find it in your textbook, right? There's a copy right there in your workbook. Then you have to decide, are you an untrained individual or a trained, aerobically trained individual? All right? And if you say you're aerobically trained, then they ask you how many years of training you had. So for some of you, that number can be very large, because if you're a soccer player and you've been playing soccer since you were 10 years old, right, then you have about 10 years worth of probably no time off aerobic training, right? So I always say, you know, go back to the last time you took 3 months off of training, and that can be your start point for that one, okay? So if you don't take any time off, just go back to when you started training. Think a little bit carefully about whether or not your workouts and training are aerobic or anaerobic, right? So if I'm a gymnast and they made me run a mile twice a week, am I aerobically trained, right? And they don't give us enough information. I always find this particular lab a little bit frustrating, because they don't give us enough information really to answer that question. Now, my answer would be, I don't think that would count as aerobic training, because the minimum requirement for health is 3 times a week for health, right? So if I only run twice a week, I probably can't count myself as aerobically trained. I don't know. I guess it depends what your anaerobic workout is like, right? So just make your best guess, okay? The world is not going to fall apart if you make the wrong decision. Or here's an idea: do both of them, right? Do the untrained and the trained and see what the comparison is. It will take you all of 5 extra minutes, right? Okay, so you can do that one. And don't worry about the extension activity unless you have the time. If you've got the time, I always encourage you, the more you play with the exercise, the more you play with the numbers, the more you play with the idea, the better comprehension you'll have of how and when to use it, all right? Okay? So then you're just going to load the worksheet 4.1, which is on page 26, into Blackboard. I don't think I have those up yet, so I'll get those up this afternoon for you. And then the other lab you're going to do is lab 10. And lab 10 takes no time at all. It's a bit of an odd lab. Technically it's validated, otherwise they would not have it in the workbook. But I have to say I do find it quite an interesting idea. So before we look at that, let me show you the walk test. No, that's the wrong thing. There we go. All right, so this is up on Blackboard for you, because you just want as many instruments as possible so that you can use the most appropriate test for the person that you're working with, all right? So this is up under extra resources, or whatever that folder is called, all right? So this is just a straight 1 mile walk test, all right? Remember though that your person may not be fit enough to walk 1 mile, so you may have to use the non-exercise version first, right? It's very easy to calculate, and it's a good one to have in your back pocket, because when you tell someone they've got to do a run test, some people go a little bit pale around the gills. So, okay. So anyway, that's there for you. I would print it out and keep it with all your paperwork, right? Because as I said, when you go out into the field, and this is your job now, you want as many alternatives as you can for running fitness tests on people, all right? Okay. So, Lab 10 is a non-exercise ventilatory threshold estimate. So the interesting thing, make sure that you read the background carefully on this workbook, all right, on this particular one. Because the interesting thing about ventilatory threshold is that it's quite close to a lactate threshold, right? They represent a very similar boundary physiologically. That's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, a lactate threshold test involves a blood draw, which involves all kinds of annoying paperwork and permissions to run, right? Plus it's expensive, okay? A ventilatory threshold, this one is a non-exercise one, doesn't take any equipment, right? But lactate threshold is an even better indicator of your aerobic capacity than my VO2 max, because my VO2 max plateaus and my lactate threshold doesn't, right? So if I can estimate lactate threshold using ventilatory threshold, then I can use that information to look at how much fitter I'm getting, how much better my aerobic capacity is getting. All right? Read that very carefully. And then if you've got questions about it, you can ask me tomorrow in class. I may not be able to answer them, but I will try my best. All right? And that's really, really quick, because all you need is your age and your height. My cynical self says I don't know how they can calculate ventilatory threshold with just age and height, but it is a non-exercise estimate. So I guess it's the same way as they can estimate VO2 max when I'm not moving, right? So I will try to find, I have not ever seen one, so I will spend a little bit of time trying to find an exercise ventilatory threshold test that I could maybe put a link to on Blackboard, just because I'm interested in, it's something I've never done, and I'd quite like to see if there's one out there. I'm assuming there is, but I've never seen it, so I'm going to have a bit of a dig. Okay? Questions, my friends? So what did I say I was going to do for you today? I'm going to find a VT exercise test. And I'm going to open assignments so that you can put these worksheets up on Blackboard. Tomorrow we will start the chapter on the respiratory system. Hint, hint. Okay. Anybody got any questions for me on lab info? PA logs, anything else like that?
No, ma'am.
Okay, make sure that you're staying on top of those physical activity logs. They can get away from you very quickly if you're not logging your information every day and keeping track of your intensity and all that sort of stuff. All right, be thinking about how you can be applying the information that we're covering in class to the activities that you're doing for your physical activity log. All right. I have office hours this afternoon from 1 until 3. If you need to talk to me about anything, I would love to see you. And that's all I have for you today, if you don't have any questions. Okay. Have a lovely day. It's going to be super warm. It's going to be a lovely warm weekend. Enjoy. Stay safe. Use your masks. All that stuff. And
Yes, ma'am.
I'll see you tomorrow.